Hello everyone and welcome back to Foreign Policy Made Simple. If you don't already know, my name is Grant Garland and I'm the one who will be trying to explain some of the most important topics in foreign policy in a way that you all can understand. Or at least that's what I hope anyway. In this videocast, I will be discussing the US-China conflict and what has become a trade war between the two countries. I'll discuss not only the current situation, but more importantly, what led up to it. Now, when I say war, I don't mean guns, tanks, Apache helicopters, and all that. I mean an economic war. The US-China trade war has been in the headlines recently and has become, in my opinion, one of the most important issues in foreign policy today. Have you ever seen Made in China on one of your shirts? Have you ever seen those big ships with cargo containers on them? Well, in a small way, they have something to do with the US-China trade war. One of the most important things to understand in this conflict is the difference in how China runs their economy versus how the United States runs its economy. In these differences lies the basis for the economic war that we are going to discuss. But what is interesting is why is it a big issue now and wasn't 20 years ago? The answer may surprise you. Conflict has arisen because the way these economies work, while still different, are much more similar today than they have ever been. And these similarities are what have fostered the economic conflict that has emerged. In order to understand today's war, one must understand the history of US-China relations. Historically, China was known to be a totalitarian regime where the government controlled the entire economy as well as the way of life for all Chinese. In contrast, the US had been known as a free market country, one with little government control on the economy. Due to this philosophical difference, there was no base for any competition between the two countries. China was focused almost exclusively on its domestic economy. Global trade wasn't a big factor. For example, in 1980, trade was less than 6% of China's GDP, a total of about $11 billion. At the same time, in the US, trade accounted for about 20% of the GDP, over $280 billion. Essentially, there was very little competition on the global markets. China wasn't competing. However, this would change. Over the next 40 years, China's exports would grow to almost $3 trillion, eclipsing the US trade of about $2.5 trillion. As the US government became more involved in the economy with FDR's New Deal, and as China started to move towards a free market country after Mao Zedong's death, everything started to change, and both economies started to become more similar. In 1949, the Chinese party leader Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China, and they drove out Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party onto the island of Taiwan. As I mentioned before, China was focused inwardly during this period of time and didn't engage with the world or America much. In 1972, US President Richard Nixon decided that China was a valuable ally to help balance the rising power of the Soviet Union, so he decided to re-establish relations with the PRC. In February of 1972, Nixon decided to spend 8 days in China to meet with Mao Zedong and discuss this establishment of US-China relations. During this time, they signed the Shanghai Communique. This communique set the stage for improved US-China relations. Mao Zedong and those before him maintained a centrally planned or command economy. A large share of the country's economic output was directed by the state, meaning that the government set production goals, controlled prices, and allocated resources throughout most of the economy. The government undertook large-scale investments in physical and human capital in order to support rapid industrialization, and as a result, around 3/4 of industrial production was produced by centrally controlled, state-owned enterprises. Private enterprises and foreign-invested firms were generally forbidden. The main goal of China's government at the time was to make China's economy relatively self-sufficient. For example, foreign trade was generally limited to obtaining those goods that could not be made or obtained in China. Due to the fact that most aspects of the economy were managed and run by the central government, there were no market forces to efficiently distribute resources, and therefore there were few incentives for firms, workers, and farmers to become more productive or to be concerned with the quality of what they produced. After the death of Mao in 1976, the government decided to gradually move away from an economy totally controlled by the government and started to gradually reform the economy according to free market principles. During this time, they opened up trade and investment with the US in hope that this would increase economic growth and raise living standards. China launched several economic reforms. These reforms included initiating price and ownership incentives for farmers, establishing 4 special economic zones along the coast for the purpose of attracting foreign investment, boosting exports, and importing high technology products into China. In addition, economic control of various enterprises was given to provincial and local governments, which allowed them to experiment with free market principles, and citizens were encouraged to start their own businesses. China also started to include trade liberalization. They removed trade barriers, which encouraged greater competition and attracted inflow. Now, let's take a look at the US economic history. After the Civil War, as industry grew, market forces encouraged the development and implementation of mass production methods. Furthermore, entrepreneurism flourished. In those days, we called entrepreneurs robber barons. For example, people like John Rockefeller, the man who commercialized oil, and J.P. Morgan, who became the largest banker in the US. Now, let's remember that Thomas Jefferson's belief in protecting the common man from political and economic tyranny and his decentralized model were still prevalent in the federal government. This all started to change, however, when small businesses, farms, and labor movements were struggling under the pressure of big businesses and the robber barons. These groups pressured the US government to intervene, to move away from purely free market governance. The government decided to adhere to their calls for help and enacted laws regulating railroads and preventing large firms from controlling a single industry. Government involvement started to dramatically increase as when the stock market crashed in 1929 and resulted in the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt became president, elected with a mandate for more government intervention in the markets, and he decided to launch the New Deal, which was a series of programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations to increase the government's involvement in the market. The impact of this move away from free markets to more government involvement is still prevalent today in the economy. So, as you can see, over the last several decades, China moved its economy away from a pure government-controlled economy to a mix of government and free market, while the US moved from a pure free market economy to one with more government intervention. While still very different, competition in the global markets by both companies was afoot. Currently, in China, there are 3 types of government interventions that China has been using to aid their economy that have played a tremendous role in US-China tensions. These interventions include 1. Having the government make decisions on investing money in industries that they think are going to benefit China. 2. Helping individual companies compete on a global stage by subsidizing input on costs. And 3. Currency manipulation. Because of the strong influence that the Chinese government still has on the economy, China has helped specific companies compete in global markets. On the other hand, the US government was more inclined to allow companies compete on an equal playing field. Now, here's where the complex stuff comes in. How do these different approaches, or say strategies, play out in the trade war? Let's imagine that a US company is selling steel for $5 and a Chinese company is selling the exact same steel for $4 because the government helped them put it on the market for cheaper. Or perhaps because the exchange rate has been manipulated such that the input costs are cheaper. Well, which steel are you more likely to buy? Clearly, the cheaper $4 steel. So that means that the US steel companies' sales decrease or go away, and the Chinese steel companies' sales have grown. Here's where tariffs come in. In order to prevent this, the US can put a tariff of $1 or say $1.50 on the steel imported from China. So now the Chinese steel costs an equal amount or more in the US. Now, you might be thinking that that solves the problem, but not so fast. Each country has its own tariff system, meaning that a country like Sweden doesn't have to abide by these US tariffs. So they have the right to buy Chinese steel at the $4 price and then, let's say, make cars out of it. Let's say a Volvo. And because there's so much steel in a car, their cars cost, say, less than 10% than the cars made in the US because those guys had to pay $5 or more for their steel. So the US steel companies are better now, but the US car companies are worse off against their global competitors. Complex, I know, but that's the base of this problem. It's hard to create a solution where everybody wins.